This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out this morning on this beautiful Colorado day with a little bit of snow, and we sincerely appreciate your interest. I'd like to acknowledge our Mayor, Russell Stewart, and our City Manager, Chris Kramer. We certainly appreciate their support of the police department. I brought you all here because I'd like to inform you all that there has been an arrest of a suspect in the August 4th, 1981 murder of Miss Sylvia Quayle. She was found murdered in her Cherry Hills Village home. Her picture is on the monitor here. I am proud to be able to tell Sylvia's sister and brother-in-law that the men and women of our department have anticipated the opportunity to make this announcement for almost 40 years. First and foremost, our thoughts are with you, the family. We can only try to understand the deep pain and sense of loss you've experienced over the years. I am pleased that there is a path moving forward to seek justice in her death. I would like to take a moment to remind everyone of the type of person who was lost to our community here in Cherry Hills Village and to her family on August 4th, 1981. Sylvia's sister and family had the quote, "Beauty seen is never lost," etched onto her grave marker, a very fitting reminder of the beautiful person she was. She was 34 years old at the time of her death. Sylvia graduated from Inglewood High School. She was ambitious, vibrant, friendly, and lit up the room when she walked in. She had a lot of friends that she would give her last dollar to if they would have needed it. Sylvia was a history buff who enjoyed researching the work of her architect uncle, Wesley Quayle. Sylvia worked at an architect firm and was very active in the Architect Secretary Association. She was a very good cook and opened a small business called The Buttery, which specialized in wedding cakes. She also had an artistic flair and created many beautiful pottery pieces of flower vases and bowls. Her sister still has many of them in the home that they live in now. She loved her little sister very much. And lastly, for this portion, Sylvia had a wonderful, loving relationship with her parents and had coffee with them every morning. They missed her deeply. So you see a lot of people with me up here this morning. There's so many individuals to thank. This was truly a team effort that spanned the course of almost 40 years. And when you think about that, that's truly remarkable. That folks that came before me, before other detectives, still kept this case on the front burner and never gave up on it. So I'd like to thank those detectives and other people from the Cherry Hills Village Police Department, technicians, past chiefs, whoever, for their assistance. I'd like to thank the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, both for their assistance at the time of the murder back in '81, but also for the follow-up over the years and recently. We have Director John Camper with us today and forensic scientist Missy Woods. And we appreciate their diligence with helping us with this case. In January of 2020, we developed a partnership with Metro Crime Stoppers and United Data Connect that led to new information regarding the case and a person of interest. More investigative work followed, and an arrest warrant was obtained in January of 2021. I'd like to thank Mitch Morrissey, the co-founder, and Joan, the investigative genetic genealogist of United Data Connect, for their assistance with this case. I'd also like to thank Board Chairman of Crime Stoppers, Mike Mills. I'd also like to thank Detective Lenny Abeda from the Cherry Hills Village Police Department and Investigator Matt Hannigan from the District Attorney's Office. They were instrumental in putting all the pieces together to make a prosecutable case. And we certainly couldn't be doing this without the assistance of the 18th Judicial District. I'd like to thank District Attorney John Kellner, Senior Deputy Chief Assistant District Attorney Chris Wilcox, and Chief Deputy District Attorney Chris Gallo. These gentlemen will be moving this case forward as the court system continues here. And then finally, I'd like to thank a couple of agencies from Nebraska who in the last couple of months were very helpful to us. First would be Sheriff Ken Moody and members of the Dawson County Sheriff's Office, and then also the Cozad Police Department, Chief Montgomery and Officer Nick Reynolds. So now I'd like to take an opportunity to provide you with some information about the suspect, if you would check the monitor. I want to remind everyone that criminal charges are merely a formal accusation that an individual has committed a crime. A defendant is presumed innocent until proven guilty. You're looking at a picture of David Dwayne Anderson. His date of birth is October 7th of 1958. The first photograph is of Anderson in 1980. If anyone recognizes this photograph of him from this time period and has information surrounding or involving this case, we ask that you please call the Cherry Hills Village Police Department tip line at 720-305-9831. The second is the booking photograph that was taken in Nebraska at the time of his arrest. Anderson was arrested on February 10th in Dawson County, Nebraska, and is currently being held on the Cherry Hills Village warrant for first-degree murder. A court proceeding was held yesterday in Nebraska, and Anderson agreed to waive extradition. No court dates will be scheduled in Colorado until he is physically present at the Arapahoe County Detention Center. So at this time, I'd like to let a couple members back here that would like to make a few comments come up. They'll introduce themselves, and then we'll move on from there.
Morning, everyone. My name is John Kellner. I'm the District Attorney for the 18th Judicial District that covers Arapahoe, Douglas, Elbert, and Lincoln counties. I am extremely honored to be able to stand in front of you today and talk about this extraordinary police work that has identified a suspect and that will hopefully shortly bring this suspect to the state of Colorado to face the charges. Now, I want to reiterate something that the chief said early on, which is that this defendant is presumed innocent. We take that very seriously and hope you do as well. I'd also want to recognize the incredible work, teamwork really, by so many folks involved that have brought us to this day. As the chief mentioned, so many incredible detectives and other partners in the police force throughout Cherry Hills Village Police Department worked this case diligently since 1981. Along the way, they've been helped by many different folks from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, and most recently, the incredible team that Mitch Morrissey has assembled at United Data Connect to help bring this case to where we are today. I'd also want to thank Crime Stoppers for constantly putting this case at the forefront by trying to engage the community and solicit tips and information to help solve this case. I'll tell you a few things that we expect to happen process-wise with respect to this defendant. As the chief mentioned, he has waived extradition, so we anticipate he will arrive in the state of Colorado in short order. We do not have a specific time frame for that. Of course, we have always concerns about security and specifics of transport of individuals, so we're not going to discuss those specifics. Once he arrives here in the state of Colorado, he will be prosecuted on charges of first-degree murder. We anticipate the formal filing of those charges shortly. Now, one word about first-degree murder as it existed in 1981. As it existed in 1981, the crime of first-degree murder, if convicted, carried with it a penalty of life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. That differs than what we have now, which is a conviction of first-degree murder would carry an automatic life in prison sentence without the possibility of parole. The charges we proceed under are basically the law that existed in 1981. Again, I am extremely grateful to be able to stand here and be able to seek justice on behalf of Sylvia Quayle, and that is solely due to the hard work of so many people over so many years. And so my message to any victims or family members of victims out there is this: this team will never stop seeking justice for you. This team will never stop trying to identify people who have taken members of our community away. This team will always continue that pursuit of justice and to keep hope. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Mike Mills, and I'm the board president of Metro Denver Crime Stoppers. 2 years ago, Mitch Morrissey and I had a conversation, and our mission at Metro Denver Crime Stoppers is to assist law enforcement in providing information anonymously to law enforcement from the community. And Mitch and I were talking. We've been very successful over the last 40 years, but we weren't doing anything towards cold cases. And Mitch came to me and said, Mike, would you be willing with your board to fund 5 pilot programs around cold case and genetic genealogy? And I said, Mitch, it sounds great. We will commit, at the time it was $15,000 to, or I think $20,000 at the time, to these first 5 cases. Happily, now we've solved all 5 cases with the help of Joan and Mitch and our law enforcement team. We have 9 cases that were open, so we continued with 4 more, 2 of which have, so 7 of 9 so far, with hopefully good news on the last 2 coming soon. That's within 2 years. Sylvia Quayle was one of the first 5, and a person of interest was named early on, but it took a lot more diligent law enforcement work, and thanks to Lenny Abeda, Cherry Hills Police Department, and investigator Matt Hannigan for their hard work. Our partnership with UDC has been tremendous. We hope to continue to do this. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, all-volunteer board, and so our funding is all through private donations. We would appreciate, if this is something that is interests you, to reach out to Metro Denver Crime Stoppers and donate towards cold cases. We've shown the success has been great, and I want to thank all of you today for having me here.
I'm Mitch Morrissey. I'm the former Denver District Attorney, and now I'm Chief of Operations of United Data Connect. And I want to thank the Chief. I've met with the Chief now a couple of times, and I want to thank her for making us part of the solution here today. I've got to tell you, Mike talked about the 5 cases that Crime Stoppers said they would partner with us on. One of them we solved up in Jefferson County. And there's a young DNA analyst up there. She used to work in Denver. She said, Mitch, if you have a slot, I worked on a case when I worked at CBI. It's a homicide down in Cherry Hills. And if you would contact Detective Abeda, I'm sure he would love your help. And so she's not here today, but that's the way that forensic DNA analysts in this state work and remember and care about the cases they worked on. It was because of her I called Detective Abeda, who probably didn't know about our program at the time, with Crime Stoppers backing, and he jumped on the opportunity to be the 5th case. So I want to thank him for that. You know, as an old prosecutor, and I am getting old, to meet Sylvia's family today means a lot to me. And when I read this case and realized that her father found her in the condition that I know she was in, the way that she was left after being brutalized and killed, I can't imagine as a father myself of a young woman about this age, to have a morning like that. And I know he's not here, and for me, that's part of the hardest part of solving these 40-year-old cases, and we've solved quite a few of them now, is that some of the people that want answers, that need closure, they don't get it because they're gone. So I'm just proud of the work that we did as part of this case, honored to be part of the team. I want to thank Cherry Hills for letting us do this, and there's more work to be done, but I know that the DAs will take care of it. Thank you.
So that concludes the comments that we have. I don't know if we can try to answer any questions. Yes.
Chief, could you talk a little bit about the motive for the crime?
I don't know if would you like to cover that? Thank you.
Obviously, at this stage, we're guided by certain ethical principles that don't allow us to talk about things that are outside the public record. There is an affidavit in this case that has been unsuppressed. I encourage anyone, if they're interested, to reach out to the court system to obtain that affidavit if you've not already done so. We can talk about process, but we're not going to talk about motive at this time.
Can you talk a little bit more about what led you to the suspect? I know you said genetic genealogy. Could you, somebody give sort of the basic description of what that is, how it works, and how you got to this fact?
Well, what we did was we took the DNA that was found at the crime scene in this case. There were more than one sample, but we took one of the samples, and what we're looking for is a single source sample. And so we obtained that through the Property Bureau here at the police department. We took that and we got it sequenced, which is a different form of DNA analysis than what you're used to in criminal cases. We got it sequenced. Once we sequenced it, then we uploaded that data to 2 different general open source websites, Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch. And we started to then get connected people that were related to the individual that we were looking for. Detective Abeta did an incredible job. In fact, took a trip down to, I believe it was Montrose, on someone that we knew was probably a cousin of sorts, but by getting that person's cooperation in DNA, then we were able to eliminate an entire line of people and then focus further on the individual that we were interested in. The detectives did a lot of work and follow up on the leads that we gave them. Remember, we're giving them investigative leads, and they're taking those leads and they're running them down. They don't always find the guy, but they lead then back to us. They close doors for us. This, I can just give you an example of the extent of the work of our genealogist. This tree that we used had over 3,300 people in it. So it is extensive background work. We use DNA for that. We use all kinds of newspapers, public records, find out about these people and who they're related to, and eventually get it down to one suspect. We get their DNA. If it matches the crime scene sample, then it gets presented to the district attorney for a determination if charges are appropriate or not.
Other questions? Yes.
Can we hear from Detective Abeta about his process through all this?
Well, I think, like Mr. Kellner said, I think what Lenny would have to offer right now would probably be very specific, but he's certainly welcome to make a couple of comments if he would like to. Okay. That does not surprise me. A lot of things have surprised me in the last couple of months. That does not. So I think as we move forward, certainly we'll be taking care of other specific questions.
Chief, could you tell us what kind of life Mr. Anderson had been leading in Nebraska?
I don't have information about that. I can tell you that he was living in Cozad, which is in Dawson County. I don't have a lot on his background right now.
You know what, the last time, I think he has a criminal record in Colorado, correct?
I believe so, yes.
Do you know roughly when the last time he was arrested anywhere?
Do you? What was it for? 1989. Come on up, Matt. We'll do it this way.
Sorry, Matt Hannigan. His last arrest was in 1989.
In Colorado?
Yes.
And do you have any sense, was he working, had he been working in Nebraska? How long had he been in Nebraska? Was he a quiet life? Anything about it?
I don't have a significant amount of details. He was certainly employed at the time of his arrest.
He was, I'm sorry.
Employed.
He was employed,
Yes, sir.
living in a small town in Nebraska.
I believe that was a small town.
Do you know if he had a family?
What's that?
Was he married, children?
I don't know all that information.
Was the suspect difficult to take into custody? Did he resist, act shocked?
Sorry. Yeah, and again, because our investigation's ongoing, I don't want to comment on those things.
Okay.
Thank you, though.
Can you, with her, Sylvia's sister and her brother-in-law, where do they live? Are they still in Colorado?
I'll take care of that. They are residents of the city of Cherry Hills Village. And I've been in very close contact with them. Absolutely wonderful people who really sometimes just don't quite have the words for what's gone on in the sense of 39 plus years. And I just know that they're definitely very grateful that Sylvia was never forgotten.
And then, Chief, you sort of alluded to it in your initial remarks, but could you just tell us how this case has touched you personally?
Well, I would have to take a very long, deep breath because I agree with Mitch. I don't know how you're not a little bit emotional, no matter who you are. I became chief here in 2012, and I can tell you that one of the things I did was ask my commander, Pat Weathers, who's been here since 1981, by the way, was not here for this event, started about 4 months later, for background, what happens, what goes on. And this is a very tight-knit community, and people have been curious. I can tell you that I received an email last night from a person. She said she was 8 years old at the time of this event, and that through the course of her life, she's gotten on the internet, tried to find out, has anything happened, couldn't find anything, and she was so grateful, and that's exactly what she said, that this case hadn't been forgotten. So in the course of my time here since 2012, I know that whenever the district attorney's office, and there's been different district attorneys in that time, George Brockler, we also had conversations with Mark Hurlburt at the time. Anytime anybody ever wanted to talk about this case, they came down to the PD, we opened it up, what would you like to talk about, what would you like to look at, and we just tried to keep moving forward. And so when Detective Abeda took the call from Mitch Morrissey and was explaining this process, I have to be honest with you, he comes into my office and he's trying to explain genetic genealogy to Chief Tovere, and I'm, okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's see what it looks like. And so we invited Mitch down along with Joan, and they sat and talked to us about it, and it was just an instant yes to get to where we are today. So even in the small time I've been here, it's been a journey, and then getting to know Joe and understanding being a little sister and what Sylvia meant to her, it's a little breathtaking. So, yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, ma'am.
Were there law enforcement agencies in Nebraska that were involved with taking the suspect into custody?
Yes, that would have been Dawson County, I think, helped out the most, but we also had worked with the Cozad Police Department prior to that.
Do you remember this case from before you became chief? Have you been around long enough to remember this case from when you were much younger?
So that was a good way to put that. Thank you. I started at the Lakewood Police Department in 1983, so no, I was not aware of this case. But I was aware of some of the other cases that Mr. Morrissey talked about back in the day. Yeah. Anything else? Anything else from the group? So I would like to just end this by, again, thanking you all for being here and showing interest in this case. It's very important. Like Mr. Kellner said, we're not the only one here. The solving of these cases through this type of technology has not stopped. I hope other chiefs get the opportunity to stand here as I have today, and we want other families to feel the progress that we've made here today with Sylvia. And I think that's the most important thing that you can take out of this day with us today, is to take a look at her picture and to know this was about her. So, yes?
Can we just have the people who haven't spoken introduce themselves, or you tell us who they are? There's a few people that haven't spoken.
Well, I think I'll let them do that for you so you can put name to paper. But again, thank you all for being here today.
And welcome to another Season 2 episode of True Crime XS. So this episode kicks off a little series that we're doing on a couple of cases. And I say a couple because this came up in the larger conversation about what we were looking at in Colorado. Today, we're still in Colorado, but I do want to point out a couple of things.
A beloved grandmother murdered in a small farm town.
There was quite a bit of a struggle. She had broken bones, bruising, and injuries.
But leads were scarce, and the case went cold.
They couldn't find anybody. Somebody got away with something really horrible here.
Then a local farmer began his own investigation.
Bert's always viewed himself as a super cop, and he wanted to be the one that would solve it.
Suddenly, an informant.
A young girl was saying that she knew who committed the murder.
Before long, a list of 6 suspects and strange confessions.
She was kicking, screaming. He had his hand at her throat.
Well, maybe I was actually there and just don't remember it.
But there was one holdout. One suspect who insisted he was no killer.
He knew he was innocent. He's the only one that did not cave.
A mystery of memory, dreams, and DNA. A case thought closed, forced, wide open.
How did not one person stop and say, wait a minute, this isn't making sense?
This was the worst miscarriage of justice in the history of the state of Nebraska, and probably one of the worst in the entire United States.
With a twist no one expected.
We knew what happened, then we're told, hey, everything that you've believed your whole adult life is no longer true.
What do you think of that?
Honestly, I felt really painfully sorry for Joseph, and I can't remember what his last name was.
The guy that proclaimed his innocence the whole time?
The guy that never gave in, and
He was the only one.
He spent time in jail, and then he got out of jail, and like they were released. It seemed, so I read, and then like I watched the documentary. I believe it came out yesterday or perhaps the day before, but you know, it's,
yeah.
I watch things, and you know, it perfectly illustrated. In the last couple of episodes, I've made a couple of comments about not always agreeing with the tactics used by law enforcement. And while the it was just one show, the documentary that was released about this, it indicated that they didn't feel like the main investigator had done it with any sort of malice. And that's their opinion, and that's fine. But I think it's really difficult to get it. 6 people total were put in jail, and I believe only one of them went to trial, and the rest of them all pleaded guilty. And I think that's really hard to do without a little bit of malice, because there was no physical evidence. In fact, there was like contradictory physical evidence. And
Is that who you're talking
Joseph
about?
White, yeah.
Just so we say the names, it's Joseph White, Thomas Winslow, Ada Taylor, Deborah Sheldon, James Dean, and Kathy Gonzalez. These are the people we're talking about.
Right. And Joseph had like a weird nickname, Mojo, something like that. I don't know what his name was.
I heard the name, but it didn't stick with me.
And it didn't stick with me either, because it didn't make sense, because his first name is Joseph. So the first one should be Joe. It doesn't matter. He was as it turns out, quite an upstanding guy, is my understanding of it. And his mother was on the show, and I just wanted to give her a hug because I felt so sorry for her. And, she never lost faith in her son as he proclaimed his innocence, with 5 people testifying against him, saying they were there and witnessed it, and they put themselves in jail. He's the only one who said, no, I was not there. And it took a whole new generation of investigators. I don't even know why they were looking into it.
So, just the cliff notes of what we're doing here. The case that Meg and I are talking about is referred to as the Beatrice Six. Joseph White, Thomas Winslow, Ada Joanne Taylor, Deborah Sheldon, James Dean, and Kathy Gonzalez were all falsely found guilty of the 1985 rape and murder of Helen Winslow in Beatrice, Nebraska, and they served prison terms before finally being exonerated in 2009. This is just like the Wikipedia cliff notes on this. The conviction was won on 5 confessions which were obtained under threats that they would be given the death penalty if they did not. Additionally, Dr. Rena Roy, the Nebraska State Patrol forensic scientist who did the blood and semen analysis, was never called to the stand to testify during the case, despite her analysis determining that none of the defendants on trial were a specific match to blood or semen found at the scene. Now, in 2008, DNA evidence implicated Bruce Allen Smith in the murders, who was an original prime suspect who had died back in 1992. And all of the Beatrice Six were exonerated the following year. Most of the defendants were persuaded by a policeman named Wayne Price that they had repressed memories of the crime. Joseph White, had maintained his innocence and had demanded the examination of DNA evidence that led to their exoneration, and then filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Gage County, Nebraska, for him and the others, which went to trial in 2014. In July of 2016, a jury awarded them $28 million. The county appealed, and it reached the Supreme Court of the United States, not Nebraska. And they denied the state's appeal, or the county's appeal, on March 4th of 2019. And Gage County had to raise their property taxes to the maximum amount permitted under law in order to pay off this jury award. It's expected that the county will make payments twice a year after property taxes are collected. The Beatrice Six, including the heirs of Joseph White, who he died in a workplace accident in 2011, they should receive their first payment around May of 2019. So they should have already gotten this payment. But what we're talking about is on Discovery Plus, and there's a free trial of it. I'm not going to plug Discovery Plus necessarily. There's a documentary right now that's just premiered as part of their original programming with Keith Morrison from Dateline narrating it. And it is an absolutely fascinating watch, and you should check it out. But this is Meg and I checking in with each other on what we thought of it.
Joseph White, according to his mother, and he was from Alabama. He had come to Beatrice with one of the female co-defendant. She was a co-defendant, one of the women that was convicted. He had come to Beatrice to try and help her regain access to her daughter, which she had lost there were problems there, and through the court system, custodially, she wasn't able to see her daughter. And so he was there to assist her, he was trying to help a friend out. Ends up back in Alabama where his mother is. It is the craziest story to me because it just puts the dot on the end of my statement about sort of when law enforcement get tunnel vision, pushing to solve a case and they're just going in the complete wrong direction. Essentially, a very respected, well-liked grandmother was brutally attacked and raped and murdered in her home. And they found the bodily fluid of a B-type non-secretor. So this was in the mid-'80s. So, there was no DNA testing. I saw the case as a small town cop wanting to be the one that saw what everybody else missed. I was shocked at how willingly everybody sort of accepted that, because when the family is leaving the trial where Joseph White, so when Joseph White was convicted, her family left believing justice was being served, that 5 people had pleaded out and essentially were in jail. And, thank God he didn't get the death penalty. The most intriguing part of this is that he never gave up on the system. He told his mom every time he saw her that it was going to get straightened out. And it took a whole new generation of investigators after he wrote a letter, sort of advice. The prison minister told Joseph that he thought he should contact this attorney, and it was an attorney who, did innocence work, because the minister believed he really didn't do anything. And so what ended up happening ultimately was new investigators, new law enforcement, new prosecution for the state, they all looked at the case. And because of that contradictory evidence, you've got a situation where you've got one person's bodily fluid at a vicious crime scene. There was no indication that there was any robbery at this crime scene. And it does not make sense that 6 people ultimately did that.
Yeah, it doesn't. And so this case it's bizarre for a number of reasons. There was somebody in there that you didn't like. I think you found him villainous. He was one of the local cops, right?
Well, yeah. And when he started, it's bad enough when one person is convicted, but this had lots of opportunities to get resolved.
They have a police psychologist involved in this that gets involved in every single one of these people except for Joseph White. So 5 out of the 6 confessed to this crime, which turns out to have been perpetrated by Bruce Allen Smith. So this all goes back to Bruce Allen Smith, who had died in 1992, and he comes up in what else we're doing. But the police psychologist involved in that area had convinced 5 of these people that they had repressed the memories of the night of the crime. They had blacked it out.
I just want to clarify that it was a doctor who was a reserve sheriff.
You're talking about Wayne Price, right?
So he was wearing 2 hats.
Right.
He was not the law enforcement psychologist. He was a psychologist or a psychiatrist. He was a doctor. And he also was a reserve sheriff. And the reason he got involved to begin with is because one of the female suspects came from North Carolina, and he had treated her previously for what I understood to be a very severe personality disorder, is what it seemed like they were saying. And so he came in to assure competency. And it was just, for one thing, that should not have occurred, because he was her doctor. That was a huge conflict of interest, and nobody seemed to realize that. And it was really weird because, I don't know that it was done with malice, but when you've got one person being convicted, that's one thing. When you've got 6, it's a whole nother one. And I think that it is this kind of law enforcement that I have in the back of my head, is what I'm getting at.
These are the people that trip your trigger, huh?
Well, I don't want to say it's him personally, because it's not really him personally. It's where it's where you forget the defendants are people, and, that lives got ruined here, because it was very clear later on that it was ridiculous. Like, it wasn't a mistake. It was ridiculous. I feel like there is a line where, mistakes happen, and it genuinely is, a mistake. But this, it wasn't a mistake. It was almost a campaign.
Well, it really was. I don't know if campaign's the right word, but they were definitely on a mission, because this took a lot of effort.
They wanted to solve the murder. And, it starts out, and if you watch, it's on a streaming service. I watched it. But it starts out with someone giving a pseudo confession account of what happened. And she implicates people who in turn implicate others. Part of it is this, psychologist, sheriff reserve convinces these people that they are blocking out their memory of their activity involved in the murder, and that they are doing it as a coping or protective mechanism. Their brain is doing it to them. In the meantime, subliminally, they're seeing things that, accompanied with the fact that they're sitting, being interrogated, and they were arrested based on the statements that were made from the initial person who came forward. And I know it's probably very confusing, but because they're in custody, they are then relying on this, doctor to sort of evaluate them, but also he's giving them guidance to make them think that they have somehow suppressed the fact that they were involved in this murder. He does it over and over again. It was really weird. Not a single one of them was a B-type blood non-secretor. It was really bizarre that didn't seem to... They used language that, for example, it was similar to. So one of them had a B-type blood, but it was that they were a secretor. And so, they were like, it was similar to, and which is, while it's not a lie, it's also not the truth. And when we were doing our episode about Jessica Chambers' murder and, why not try Eric? We talked about how, in that case, a cannot be excluded piece of evidence. So a piece of evidence was tested for DNA, and the statement was made that the DNA from that object the person could not be excluded as the contributor of it. It's his DNA. And so it's a similar thing happening here, where they're saying that someone with type B blood, even though they were a secretor when they knew the perpetrator was a non-secretor, they're saying the blood was similar to. Everybody hears that and they say, oh, well, it's similar to it. So, under the circumstances, it's got to be, it's proof, right? Except that's not really what was happening there. And one of the things that really just I felt like it was a gut punch. And it was interesting because, and they talk about it on the show, but they showed Joseph a picture of the victim. And they said, do you know who this is? And he said, well, no, it's just an old lady. I have no idea who it is. To the jury, they're going, he doesn't even care enough about her to know who she was, and he killed her, And I thought, well, in a real situation where you are seeking justice, this is not the kind of thing that happens. Like, as far as setting up these dramatic things to make a defendant look really terrible, because he was legitimately just saying, I don't know who she is. He probably didn't even realize that was the victim of the murder that he was on trial for. And he didn't think twice about saying he didn't know her. So that goes from justice to a setup. because I feel like in a situation with cool tempers and balanced system, a conviction could occur, without having to make statements that are, while not a lie, also not true.
Yeah, well, it became this double-edged sword. And I remember reading about the Nebraska State Patrol not being involved. The defense didn't call the people involved, and the prosecution didn't use them. Okay, the reason the prosecution didn't use them is because most of the Nebraska State Patrol forensics lab would had to have said, these people don't match what's at the crime scene. And the defense thought that if they called her, there's a specific woman named Dr. Rena Roy who's I was most interested in. If the defense would have called her, they were worried that they would point the finger and say, well, yeah, it's possible they were there. So it became this like double-edged sword, don't call her, when in reality, what she would have had to have said is, I recovered fibers, blood, and semen at the scene, and it doesn't match any of the people that are charged in this case.
Right. And so what does that do to a jury?
Well, that would have, they lost their reasonable doubt there by stifling her on both sides. Like, you could have submitted the case from the prosecution's perspective if she would have been on, their storyline, but she wasn't, so they didn't call her. And the defense could have created reasonable doubt by having her say, these people don't match. None of these people that are charged in this, or whoever's sitting in that chair right now during this trial, but also they didn't all go to trial here.
No,
that was the other problem.
Joseph went to trial. That was it. The last man to take a plea, the two ladies and James Dean, they have all pleaded out like early on. Tom holds out along with Joseph. It was he caved, essentially, was how I saw it. He caved in that he testified against Joseph in exchange for, a plea deal. One of the poignant parts of the documentary is when Joseph wrote the innocence attorney, and he started looking into the case, like he went very cordially, very diplomatically to Tom in jail because he felt like he had some pretty damaging testimony to give against. He says to him just very, I don't want to say nonchalantly, but just very even toned and very, I want to get to the bottom of this. He says, Joseph tells me like he wasn't even there. And he said the very first thing Tom did, like in that visiting room, was break down and cry. And he says, I wasn't there either. And I have felt so terrible for testifying against him all these years. I just didn't know what to do. I understand where you can get into a corner, and I see very clearly why they did what they did. And I don't hold it against any of them. But I do want to say that I am disappointed in law enforcement, and I'm disappointed in prosecutions that might infer things that aren't real, like the evidence in this case. And I don't know that the defense, because they're in the middle of it and not like looking back on it like we are, I don't know that they realize those poignant moments, like when they're happening. For example, in this case, we can very easily say, if we could, go back in time and kind of have a consulting role here, we would say, be sure and tell them the evidence doesn't match somehow, right? And we would want their case to work towards actually calling the witness, and saying, no, it doesn't match any of them. And so, but we have the benefit of hindsight with that. And that's, you don't have that when it's occurring. I think it's important to be aware of what's happening, and in this case, and that's why it became a Keith Morrison special on the Discovery Channel, is because it is such a blatantly terrible case, and there is no redemption to be had there, but you learn from your mistakes and move forward. But it pains me that in the middle of all that, somebody didn't go, what am I doing? Which is sort of where, when we were doing Jessica Chambers' murder case, I felt this same sort of thing, like, why doesn't somebody go, what are we doing? And so when you start seeing these things over and over and over again, gets in your head that that could possibly be happening.
Yeah, and so the other thing is, like, I think about us, like all the things that we're doing at one time. I'm chasing a family in North Carolina that just like vanished off the face of the earth. I'm looking for a serial killer in Colorado, and like I'm running down all these missing kids cases sort of one at a time. And when I do that, I still am hanging out with my family, and I'm doing creative projects and stuff on the side. And I realize like how human I am when I start stretching myself through too thin. But I also realize that like all of these people are human. And this argument came up recently where there's a sheriff that I don't agree with. Somebody said, well, you know, all these things that are bad character are okay. And I'm not naming him or naming anything about it. But my point in all that is, no, bad character is not okay, because that's reflective of what type of human they are.
Well, yeah, definitely.
And that's what makes like these problematic systems around the country, locally, state level, depending on the jurisdiction, sometimes even federal. That's what makes these cases so disastrous. I mean, the Beatrice 6 case will have cost that county and space, I think it's a town, it will have cost the people of that town in excess of $35 million by the time it's all said and done. If you look at the cost of the trials, the cost of all of the legal defense, all of the, just taking it to the Supreme Court to then be told you have to pay these people. All of those things that happened, that's very costly. And that's really the result of somebody, because this is a 1985 case when this all kicks off. It's the elections in the 70s and 80s leading up to this that caused that to happen.
Right. And it seems like it has gotten better because they realized enough to they were trying to make the situation right. And so I just want to throw it out there, like, and it's not a personal thing. This is not something that just automatically happens. People make decisions, and this is what, the results of the decisions are what the future lives with, essentially.
Exactly. So going from that for a second, we are looking at Colorado kids cases, having more relaxed formats so that we can talk about some of the stuff going on in true crime. But there's one other thing I want to point out here, and I don't know if you saw this or heard this. I heard this, and I think you saw this. This is The Clown and the Candy Man is out.
That's correct. I'm a little bit confused on, so there was it was one, and then suddenly there was two. So I'm not actually sure if it's an ongoing series or.
Well, so I listened to about an 8-part podcast on this that I think is going to reflect what is happening there. And the reason it comes up while we're talking is two of the most prolific serial killers that we are never going to cover because everybody else on the planet has covered, at least we're not going to cover them like without relation to something else, are the subject of this podcast and I guess a documentary series. What is interesting about what they're doing is they are taking crimes of Dean Corll and the crimes of John Wayne Gacy, and they are seeing if there is a larger link between them. So I'm a little ahead of you on that, I think, because it's fascinating. Like they're weaving these stories into, I think I told you, it's like a really dark and disgusting tapestry. It just happens that some of the cases that we're covering in the Colorado cases are right in between the arrest in 1973 of Dean Corll and I think it's 1978 for John Gacy. We're covering some cases of missing young men that happen like right in the middle of that. And
that is what led me to, yeah, it is. You're right, because in the early 70s, Texas, and then 78 in Illinois, there were some surrounding states that came involved as the victims were being identified. But it is right during that time period. And in Colorado, from yesterday back, there's 49 cases of people under 18, children and young adults under 18 missing in Colorado. 19 of them are male and 30 of them are females. And of course, when you're looking at those 19 males, and as you get started, I believe the very first one is the early 70s. And so, of course, when you start looking into teenage guys that went missing in their teenage years in the early 70s, you get into the Candyman and the Killer Clown. It's just one of those things. What did you, now I have not listened to the podcast, and I did watch either I've watched 2 episodes of a series or I've watched the entire thing, if that's all there is. I'm not entirely sure. So that's the information I sort of had. Now, of course, I know about, I didn't really know that much about the Candyman. I did a little bit because it has an interesting component to it where the teenage boy that was helping him ultimately killed him. So
Two of them.
Well, it was just the one guy that killed him.
Well, the one killed him, but there were 2 boys helping him. Sorry.
Right. And then with John Wayne Gacy, he was a little before my time, but he was, a terrible person. And who am I to judge though, right? Actually, it's fair to say he was a terrible person. So you have John Wayne Gacy preying on teenage boys in the 70s in the Chicago area. And then now I don't know, while I'm aware of the cases of their tirade as serial killers, I don't know when this whole thing started with a link being made with the underage teenage boy trafficking. Is that?
Yeah, it's trafficking. So what they've done is they took those 2 cases and I don't know how far into this you've actually gotten, and I don't know if I want to ruin it for you because it's kind of bonkers. But there's a Boy Scout troop down in Louisiana. I think they were Troop 137, and they were found to be pretty much systematically abusing boys. There's a pedophile in the mix called John Norman. And then there's this Fox Island up in Michigan, in the Great Lakes area. All of these things, the investigators and the researchers that helped ID or whoever produced this, put it together. Their idea is that when you see similarities between John Wayne Gacy's handcuff trick and Dean Corll's rope trick, I think is how, or vice versa, when you see those, they're thinking that some of those things were taught to them and that they're possibly linked to a much, much greater ring of criminals. They even go so far as this one guy contacted Gacy for years. He was up in Canada and he didn't know what to think of Gacy, but he wanted to get his whole story and he records all these calls with him. His point was there were a few times that people went missing that wound up in Gacy's crawl space that did not appear to be Gacy was out of town during that time and he didn't come back in the official records that the police had on him. It sort of speculates that somebody else was possibly disposing of bodies there as well, and that these 2 killers overall, while prolific, were not necessarily doing it alone. Now, we know Corll had teenage accomplices, but the suggestion is that this network of people is creating child pornography and trafficking these boys and then eventually sort of jettisoning them. And the way that they get jettisoned is they get disposed of in a crawl space or stuck in one of the burial sites. And that's what Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy ate the rap for. It's a fascinating look at it. Is it
really? Is that how you feel, that it's fascinating?
So you think the possibility that there was a national sex trafficking ring of 12 people that we caught 2 of is not fascinating?
No, that's not correct. What I'm saying is there's no question that there is according to information out there, human trafficking is a problem. Okay.
Yes.
And if you look through history at statistics, it is apparent that teenagers go missing. Sometimes they run away, and then there's always the theory that they could be trafficked. Okay. Now, without saying anything negative about anything, all right, human trafficking exists. It was going on in the 70s. I think that John Wayne Gacy used this as a tactic when he was scared that he was about to be put to death for killing 33 young men. And if I think about it for too long, it makes me really mad. Anybody would buy into him trying to delegate blame for the victims that he killed onto this fictitious ring of, and I mean fictitious in that they were not involved with his murders. It is absolutely ludicrous to think that somebody was dropping off bodies at John Wayne Gacy's house. I feel like it's sort of a cop-out, and I get where people want to have, a new perspective on things. That's like literally what we do. But for some reason, this one just really pisses me off.
Okay, well, let me explain to you where that idea comes from. That idea comes from Dean Corll, Elmer Henley, and David Brooks.
I understand
He
that.
was using, well, you just described what Dean Corll was doing and said it's bullshit with John Wayne Gacy. And their numbers are about the same, realistically.
No, I think John Wayne Gacy, specifically, I think the reason that I think he wanted to beat Dean Corll specifically.
Well, so as your series goes along there, where are you at in the series?
There's only 2 episodes. I've watched them both.
But have they?
Well,
I have not seen the video.
It is not
obviously
a chronological thing.
No. What I was going to say was, have you met a guy from Canada talking to Gacy on the phone?
Yes, and he doesn't even believe what he's saying. He says it at the end. He says, I didn't cry any tears when he was put to death. I didn't have any sympathy for him.
Well, maybe that's all of it then. But did they talk about the fact that Gacy hired one of Corll's friends?
For his construction business?
Yeah.
It was pretty much a coincidence.
No, I've known about that for 20 years.
Okay, that's fine. It occurred, but this, okay?
You think a guy in Chicago and a guy in Houston who just happened to murder 30 boys each after torturing them using these tricks, the hand coat trick, the rope trick, you think that Gacy either developed that off of that or it's a complete coincidence?
I don't think that it's a complete coincidence. I believe he even says that he got that from Corll.
So these people as investigators might be making the leap that basically what Gacy was doing in emulation, I guess, would be what are now being seen as coincidences. Because
I think that I need to take a more diplomatic approach to this. It is emotional to me because I feel like do you really think that this is a thing? I'm not saying that the things don't exist. I'm saying that they don't exist as one thing. It's not one thing.
So when I looked at this, and this is the reason we're never going to cover Gacy or Corll on their own right, and I'm not ruling out hunting for some of the people that are unidentified, but I'm saying in the instances, this was my problem with the case. So Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy are too far apart in time to have been part of the same ring together. And people don't understand that, but you have to look at their ages and where they were in business and where they were in life and what they were doing. If you look at that, the fact that Corll is killed by Elmer Henley in 1973 and everything about him comes out, we don't get his whole story. So Gacy not being arrested for 5 years had plenty of time, although he had been active a little longer than that. We had plenty of time. Gacy starts being active in 1972. The Houston mass murderer was known about at that time, but it wasn't known that it was Dean Corll. I am realizing something as we talk about this that you have said, and now I'm understanding how it works, and that is that pedophiles make you angry.
They do,
And
indeed.
so one of the problems that we run into with this whole thing that's going on is sort of being linked between Gacy and Corll. One, I entertained it from the perspective of looking at the Oakland child killings, which sort of happened between Corll being shot and killed and Gacy being arrested later. the Oakland child killings occur, and then there's these other odd cases that happen. But you brought up a really good point. I have been looking at it like that's what organized crime does. They replace lost parts pretty quickly. And you were saying that, yes, you could link all of these things if you wanted to, but it would largely be fiction. But your point was the definition of pedophilia and the way that works today versus the actual age of these victims, notwithstanding the fact that they truly are victims, those two things don't really line up. And you can call this, child abuse. You can call this child pornography in many instances if there were to be photos and a ring involved. But what you can't really call it is pedophilia because most of these are teenagers.
Well, actually, we've talked about this before with Jeffrey Dahmer, and boiling it down to semantics, perhaps I am mistaken. However, it cannot be ignored that societal thing, mainstream anyway, would be that John Wayne Gacy was gay, essentially. He was a homosexual, and he was put down for being homosexual. Okay. And that's reflected in the monster he turns into, and he becomes this killer. But I consider him to be, a messed up person who took advantage of teenage boys and then murdered them. And there's all kinds of things you can dissect there, but ultimately, and maybe I'm incorrect in this, but pedophilia, actual pedophilia. Okay. Do you have the definition there?
It's sexual feelings towards children, but do you want to know?
I'm playing semantics here.
Oh, well, the semantics of that are pedophilia is a psychiatric disorder where someone is attracted to prepubescent people. And that means girls and boys who are under the age of having gone through puberty. So the cutoff, if you were being very general, is 12 years old. It's under 12 years old.
So it's girls that have not developed. It's boys who have not developed. And essentially, it's the stage in life of innocence, essentially. And you can't even really tell girls and boys apart except, they have different parts. But, there's no adult growing happening. Right.
And that's where these cases aren't linked anymore. That's where, so we're clear. We're talking about the clown and the Candyman, Dean Corll's victim of choice are young boys, and more than likely John Wayne Gacy, after Dean Corll was killed and his story became known, was taking a page out of his book and starting to do some of the things he had seen unfold in the media. His victims of choice also being what I would call the young hustler crowd, but also some innocent teenage boys as well. And the Oakland County child killer, which the series and the podcast throws right in the middle of all this, as well as some of the other instances, those are children that are largely under the age of 16 and even under the age of 12 in many instances. This situation being could all of this be connected?
Right. Now, okay, the other side of this is, is it really a pedophile ring that they're talking about? Are they just talking about human trafficking? Where does the line go? Now,
human trafficking can involve all ages.
I am aware of that. That's why I'm saying there is the other side of that. However, it seems like pedophiles, the title of being a pedophile, and I'm not saying this to make anybody make it okay, because it's not okay. But John Wayne Gacy raping teenage boys and murdering them, it has nothing to do with being a pedophile.
Right. And so this gets into there's a couple of pieces of semantics since we're already on it. I may as well mention it. It's not child pornography. It's child abuse. Child pornography is the way that it's written up in a legal matter. But human trafficking is not acceptable for any age. But when you do start mixing and matching, and that is what they're doing with the clown and the Candyman, is mixing and matching victim types and possibly similar killings, and not really understanding the difference between frustrated gay men who had been charged with sodomy turning their rage towards hustlers.
I don't think
being
we
different
should
than
call the victims hustlers. I'm sorry.
That's where he started, though. That's what I'm saying. Like, what happens? Okay,
I just don't want anything that they might have been doing, like lessening what happened to them. That's it.
All right. You know what? Okay, that was a description that was used in legal papers. I will back it up and I'll say this. Turning your own conviction for sodomy of a teenager into rage against other teenagers who were essentially taking your money in exchange for your time, your favors, whatever it is that you're asking for. That's just not the same as stealing a child. That's the first place that they differ. But assaulting a child is much, much, much different than assaulting a teenager. They're both terrible acts. They're both horrible acts. But psychologically, they come from two entirely different places.
And I think that gets misunderstood.
It does. And a lot of these, you're right. And the reason I'm taking so long to clarify this is because we have had to very carefully differentiate who is a sex offender and a serial killer versus who is a child abuser and a child killer, because it does mean something to the other cases that you look at that surround them.
It does. And actually, if I may, I don't really know. This is a little bit off, but it kind of goes along with what I'm saying. And you may have an opinion about this. It's a little bit further in the future. It is in Colorado. There was a young 7-month-old boy named Christopher Enoch Abeda who was taken from his parents' bedroom in the middle of the night. And the reason that I bring that up, as we were talking about distinguishing the possibility of, when serial killers are actually pedophiles versus when they're not. In my head, I read that case. So I read that case and I thought to myself, he was kidnapped, and he was kidnapped to be somebody's child, or to be by a medium to become someone's child. Like, does that make sense? Like
adoption type thing.
Yeah, right. He was not taken to be killed. It is, and I'm not saying that can never happen, okay? Because anything could happen. But it is very, very, very rare that a 7-month-old would be taken for any sort of sexual human trafficking or to be murdered specifically. It just doesn't happen. And so thinking about that, it goes along with what I'm getting at as far as actual pedophiles operating and doing what they do, and what it takes for someone to be a pedophile versus this completely different situation that we have going on with John Wayne Gacy and Dean Corll. So I was fascinated by Christopher's case and read somewhere, and then I couldn't find it, but I want to go back and find it because I like statistics, and it does put like a little bit of perspective on something. And I read somewhere in the midst of looking at Christopher's case that he, at a point in time from my 1987 until now, and I think it was recently, he was one of only 19 infants that were abducted from their beds that have never been found.
So there's a new developing theory as we're going through these Colorado cases, and this is your theory. You're basically thinking that if you were to take the 19 infants, and this is barring some sort of unknown family violence or accident where the family had disposed of it, the kids that were taken that were truly infants around the U.S., and you started to run their genetics, particularly the ones, did we say pre-1990? Is that where
my thought was they would need to be having children by now.
So we feel like if you were to run these kids' genetics that into like a 23andMe site or into Ancestry, you would basically over the next few years, be able to start identifying the infants who had disappeared and who they had possibly become if they happened to be in a situation where they were, illegally sold or adopted into a position as a fill-in child. Like, basically, if someone were taking them for the sake of having a child, this would be the time that you start to find those children.
Right. And so this, I am sure, is not it came to my brain and I didn't get it from anywhere, but I'm sure it's not a novel idea. I mean, the stuff is out there. It occurred to me, especially that, okay, so and this is just from my experience. And like I said, anything could happen. Okay. Really, it could. But most of the time, and when I say infant, I mean like a baby that can't walk or talk, for the most part, a little baby, okay? Not a toddler, a little baby. When they go missing, most of the time, it has something to do with their direct caregiver, okay? Their parents. Now, I don't think that that's the case in Christopher's case. I'm just clarifying what reading 5 gazillion cases over time has made my gut feel. Okay. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Most of the time, children who disappear, the parents did something. And, I would even go so far as to say, even in those cases, if the child has died and the parents are covering it up and saying that the child is missing, I would say like 99.9% of those cases, the child died from either an accident or some sort of like enraged fit by, the parent or somebody close to the child. I don't think anyone says, I'm going to go murder this baby. Okay. I just don't. I'm sure that, somebody could say, oh, you're wrong, this happens. It's very rare. It has to be, because babies are truly, they're truly innocent, and that is reflected. You've got parents who something happens, they get mad and, they lash out, and it's completely, it would be considered manslaughter because they had no intent. It just happened. Or they weren't watching the child had an accident, they die. And I wonder, like, in those types of situations, like when you're trying to like cover it up and, spouses, like, do they suspect the other one? Would they ever know? It's really not something we're ever going to be able to really see a whole lot of. Babies are not the typical targets of any serial killers. They're just not. If it is not the parents, it comes into play here because Christopher had 6 older brothers and sisters, and I believe the next child was 16 years older than him. So he was the parents' like late in life surprise, and that was actually put down a little bit. But to me, it like saying, oh well, maybe they didn't want him or something. But to me, it just said like, oh, there were a whole lot of other people who could have taken care of this child if they didn't, for some reason, the mother and father didn't or couldn't. Right. And so, one of the siblings would have been like, okay, come live with me. So anyway, to me, it showed the opposite. Now, in kids, so if the parents didn't accidentally kill them or didn't fly off the handle and kill them, then if it is truly a stranger kidnapping, and what that means is somebody that you do not know, that has absolutely no connection to your family, takes the child. And that's really hard to find because most kidnapping cases, there is some connection, as small as it may end up being. There is some tie that causes the kidnapping. There is a connection. It is not a true stranger abduction. The cases where children are abducted, they are abducted because somebody wants them to be their child.
Right, and that's sort of what we're getting at. So over the course of the next couple of episodes, we're going to rule out 49 cases as to whether they could potentially be the work of a young serial killer operating in Colorado. Christopher Enoch Abeda, was last seen in the early morning hours of July 15, 1986. Christopher's parents could not locate their son. They had put him in bed at midnight and found his crib empty in the morning. The garage door opener was missing and a basement window was open. Christopher has never been heard from again. At 6:30 a.m., his parents alerted the police. Arriving officers could not find any signs of forced entry, but the front door was unlocked on the night of his disappearance. Members of Christopher's family initially seemed like potential suspects in his case. His parents had separated prior to his disappearance, but were reconciling, and the night of Christopher's disappearance was the first night his father had spent in the home since the separation. His mother failed 2 polygraph exams, which she attributed to withdrawal from tranquilizers. Authorities haven't cleared either of Christopher's parents of involvement in the case or charged them in connection with it. 3 weeks after he vanished, they drained Quail Lake, 3 blocks from the family's home, to search for his body. They recovered nothing. Christopher's family members refuse to consider him deceased. They believe he and his guardians don't know that he's an abducted child. Christopher's loved ones operate a site featuring information about his case. Texas and New Mexico topped the list of his possible locations. According to the website, the family had been receiving hang-up phone calls for about 6 months before Christopher disappeared. The calls stopped when he vanished, then resumed again several months later. His sister believes the abductor was Emma Bradshaw, a woman who'd had an affair with Christopher's father and had a history of break-ins. Bradshaw maintains her innocence in the baby's disappearance, and the police have not named her as a suspect. In 2015, Bradshaw won a civil judgment for $150,000 against Christopher's sister for interfering with her employment. Sometime after Christopher's disappearance, the Colorado Springs Police Department destroyed most of the case evidence. His family accused them of negligence and incompetence in their investigation. Christopher's disappearance remains unsolved.
And we're going to pivot away from Christopher Abedo for now, but we will be coming back to his case. We have one more case we want to talk about today.
Andy Joe Lupley was last seen at the Texaco station at Interstate 25 and Colorado 165 in Colorado City, Colorado on May 30th, 1976. He had worked there part-time for 2 years. Lupley picked up the keys from the manager and began his shift at 6:15 a.m. Only about 15 minutes later, customers wanting to buy gas discovered the station was unattended. A short time after that, Lupley's manager and the police found Lupley's 1967 pickup truck in the station parking lot with the keys in the ignition. Inside the station, the manager's Citizen Band CB radio had its microphone ripped out, and the cash register, which had contained about $50 or $100, was empty. Lupley has never been heard from again. Authorities stated a middle-aged Caucasian male with graying sandy-colored hair and blue eyes, about 5 feet 11 inches tall, weighing about 175 pounds, was last seen at the Texaco station between 6:30 and 7:30 the morning that Lupley disappeared. The person drove a flashy 2-door late-model car, possibly a Pontiac Grand Prix, colored silver or white with maroon trim and a maroon Landau top. He was pulling an unusual 4 or 5 foot long tarp-covered plywood trailer that may have been handmade. He may have been en route to Wyoming at the time. This individual is the prime suspect in Lupley's disappearance. He has never been publicly identified. Foul play is suspected in Lupley's case. He was a senior and honor student at Rye High School at the time of his disappearance, studying motorcycle mechanics in a vocational program. He went missing just days before graduation, and he was a pole vaulter, a football player, and a basketball player, and once had been president of his class. After his graduation, Lupley planned to spend the summer working for his father as a plumbing apprentice, then enlist in the Air Force and attend Adams State College. Charles Humphrey is a suspect in Lupley's disappearance. He was a college English professor in 1976. Charles is the prime suspect in the murder of his 2 wives, Lucilla, who disappeared just days before Lupley did, and whose body was found in 1981, and Bonnie, who was murdered in December of 1979, several months after her divorce from Charles. He died by suicide before police could arrest him, and it's unclear why he's a suspect in Lupley's case. Lupley's mother believed he was abducted after he surprised someone burglarizing the gas station. Although he disappeared during the daylight hours in a high-traffic area on Memorial Day weekend, no one saw or heard anything suspicious, and his case remains unsolved.
So here's my thing about Andy's case and why he doesn't fit all of this. How does Andy get considered to be a child as far as being a Nickmick and Namus as a child? I mean, is it just because he was 17 turning 18 when he went missing or whatever?
Well,
is that why?
I think that it's a circumstantial look at anybody who disappears. And so by that, what I mean is he was in school, right? And that's one thing that would make a borderline adult be a child.
He was about to graduate high school, though. And it's almost like a no man's land in terms of how his case is looked at. But what bothers me is, okay, I am terrified of situations where gas station clerks and little coffee shop people have disappeared. And they're almost always female. Almost always women. So what bothered me about Andy's case is Andy is just working, but not just any day. It's Memorial Day weekend in an area that has a huge amount of people coming through. No one heard anything. No one saw anything. When they came looking for him, he was just gone. And they actually have a suspect drawing. I don't know if you've seen that. It's like totally generic white guy, like completely generic 35, 45-year-old white guy.
So somebody did see something.
It's supposedly he was one of the only customers that was described to them between 6:30 and 7:30 that morning.
Right. So he was at a he was a gas station attendant, essentially, and he went missing while on duty. And so if you want to spin on that, if you could change those circumstances up and if he hadn't have been at work when he was taken or went with someone, or if he had not been pretty much an ideal employee, he would probably be classified as a runaway.
Yeah, he would be. He would fall. He's really similar in age, and almost everything about Harry Milligan's case almost applies. They're off by about 24 months in age, but almost everything that applies in Harry's case applies in Andy's case. Andy had been thinking about going into the Air Force. He was he's going to work for his father that summer as a plumbing apprentice. He was an honor student, a college senior that was about to graduate. He's this 5'10", 5'9" or 5'10" inch kid, weighs 150 pounds. He was like a 3 or 4 sport athlete. The difference is his car was left behind.
And he left during the middle of his shift.
Right. So it wasn't like disappearing in the night.
Yeah, and it wasn't like he was driving home. Okay, let's think about this. If you are going to run away, you don't do it leaving your car behind in the middle of your work shift, right? It's weird.
Right.
And so, with Harry, it made sense to me because his car still hasn't been found. He was in his car on his way home. And so I guess potentially, wouldn't he have gone home and grabbed a bag before he left? But in this situation, you have Andy where he's supposed to be, and then he's just not where he's supposed to be. And it's uncharacteristic. And like I said, if he blew work off often, it wouldn't have been a big deal. Or he had just not come home, it would have been a different situation. But it makes you wonder. So you've got a physically able kid, teenager, young adult. So what I mean by that is he would have been able to defend himself probably.
If he knew what was going on,
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's something that's so strange about when I think about teenage boys being abducted, which I thought actually that in John Wayne Gacy's case, most of them were kind of small in stature, but that looking at the victims and some of his unidentified victims, some of them weren't small in stature. So it was definitely charisma that, got them into the position they ended up in. And so, I wonder if somebody had come to the gas station with some sort of emergency situation where Andy needed to help, would he have left like he did? It's something like that. It seems to me would be what would draw him away without calling the police or, I try to put things together and say what would lead this healthy, in shape teenage boy to leave without his vehicle. And so that leads you to think, well, he got in somebody else's vehicle, right? In the middle of his shift, you've got to justify the urgency of what's happening with essentially leaving the store open with no one there. So it would literally be, it would have to be a life or death situation. But then I think, well, you've got this kid who's working at, 6 o'clock in the morning. And it seems to me like that kind of kid would be responsible enough to call the police. But then again, it's in 1976. So maybe 911's not as much of a thing. I don't know. But I just try to process all that stuff through, right? And so you've got a situation where now, if he's taken by force, what does that look like?
Well, so I don't know what happens in terms of like physically what it looks like, but what I do know is that there was enough going on inside of the store that looked off. The cash register was empty. The microphone had been ripped out of the CB that they used to communicate. That makes me think that more than likely he surprised somebody. But I was wondering if it wasn't one of the, so this sounds like a little conspiracy-ish, but like say he had stepped out for whatever reason or was in the back room or whatever, this little Texaco, and someone stepped in, didn't find anybody at the counter. They're in the process of like helping themselves to a little robbery. And either Andy comes out, and by the way, he goes by Joe, which I keep forgetting to say, but either he comes out and sees them or he holds back and just steps out like to try and get their license plate number, and he gets surprised by the person and put in a trunk, or he gets clipped on the head, because I don't think anything took place in the store. I think they would have known. The police basically, about 6:30 in the morning, customers were waiting to buy gas. And by 6:45, 7 o'clock, the police were there to find Andy's truck sitting with its keys in the ignition in the parking lot, the cash register drawer empty, and the CB torn up. So it happened really fast. Whatever happened to him was not a walk away at all, unless he was the one setting it up that way. But then where does he go? Who takes him wherever he's headed?
I mean, I'm not saying that he couldn't have.
I don't know.
I know.
I can't imagine $100
you
being
didn't even break
enough
even,
to do
dude.
anything.
Oh,
Yeah. Well, his mom believes he was abducted, but he was surprised.
Clearly, he didn't run away. I mean, we're saying that, but logically, at this point in time, he didn't run away. It's just getting the jump on somebody like a young teenage boy. Well, he wasn't young. I guess he was 18. A teenage boy that's in good shape. And then, like, what's the point of it? What did he go through? Was $100 really the motivation? Like, that's crazy.
Well, it's not much of a motivation, but we've seen robberies that happen for less. It's just usually if there's a murder involved with I hate to say it that way, but like if there's this type of murder that's like a ripoff or a robbery or a shooting of a clerk, they don't typically take the body with them.
Exactly. Well,
and that's one of the things that made this so confusing.
You're right. Most of the time, so I would say all the time, if violence occurs during a robbery, it wasn't planned. Robbers don't go into stores thinking they're going to kill someone. It just happens sometimes. So, yeah, you definitely wouldn't take the person with you accidentally. And then why rip the CB radio out? Like, why if they clip him on the head and take him, why go in and rip the radio out? Like, so they...
Maybe he surprised them and they weren't sure if anybody else was there.
And that would make it a little bit more difficult for the next person who noticed to get help, maybe? I don't know.
So there is a suspect in this case, and it's so complicated, his story. His name is Charles Humphrey. So I'm going to drop Charles in here. Now, Charles is suspected of 2 other murders, but Charles is one of those people that did the only thing that you really can do to escape the police when they come looking for you. and he killed himself. So we will never truly know what was going on with Charles, at least from his perspective. But he is the prime suspect.
So let me ask you this.
And
you're right that we'll never know, but I don't think that you're right about that being the only thing you really can do. But so do you think that speaks to guilt?
well, in some instances, I believe that it indicates guilt. In some instances, I believe it indicates I don't want to go to jail.
Now, I don't actually know, was this the first approach at him by law enforcement?
The gist of it is this. In 1976, Charles Humphrey was a college English professor, and we do not know how he is linked to Lepley's case. What we do know is that Charles, in 1979, was getting divorced from his wife, Bonnie. Bonnie, after they get divorced in June, is murdered in December of 1979. In 1981, it's discovered that Bonnie, the murdered wife from 1979, is not the only suspicious case in Charles's life. Police at that time discover the body of a woman named Lucilla Humphrey, who it turns out Charles had been married to, and she has not been seen since Mother's Day of 1976. So even though her body was not found until 1981, the last person that she was seen with was Charles. After Lucilla's body is discovered, that seems to be their first real run at him as a suspect, and he kills himself. It looks like he was about to be arrested for Lucilla's disappearance, but not necessarily for Bonnie's.
So, and he was, I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, it was thought that he was seen at the gas station. And it was a kind of roundabout connection that I don't think has been released, but he was seen there. And then when these other murders came up, I remember that I thought, well, this could really be random.
Yeah. Different theories were bandied about. I am trying to still put together a couple of documents on this case, so he may come up again. But the gist of it was that Charles might have been in such desperate straits because he had gotten himself into a situation in the disposal of Lucilla's body, and just happened that he came across Joe Lepley or Andy Lepley the morning that he was trying to hightail it. And that could be why the police have honed into him so hard as a suspect this much after the fact, because it was. If you look at the two dates, they're very close together as far as when Lucilla was last seen and when she's thought to have died.
And it kind of gives the impression that maybe she went running in and said, "Help me, help me, help me," or something like that. And he.
That's an interesting idea, and that's one of the paths I want to explore with him.
Why the CB was ripped out, why he was taken with them, and he, the money was just taken to make it look like a robbery. But that explains, because what else are you going to do? You've got your kidnapped wife who has just told a teenage boy that, she's been kidnapped. And I'm speculating here, obviously, but it would be an odd situation where I do believe a husband on a roll like that would just say, okay, well, she told you, so you got to come with us, that kind of thing. And, I could see an 18-year-old not really knowing how to respond.
And next week, we think we may have found Joe Lepley as we continue our hunt for missing and possibly murdered children in Colorado. Thanks for joining us. You can reach us at 252-365-5593 or at truecrimexcess.com or truecrimexcess@gmail.com if you want to send us a note. This episode was brought to you by LabrottieCreations.com. That's LabrottieCreations.com. Check out the merchandise and specifically their fun Pop Pet art custom pieces made from photos of your very own pets. Use the promo code CRIMEXS, that's CRIMEXS, for 20% off a fun, brightly colored, happy piece of art of your own pet at their site, LabrottieCreations.com. Music in this episode was licensed for True Crime XS. The theme song was Indestructible by Noah Smith. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform or at TeePublic, Instagram, or Twitter. You can also join us on Patreon to fund future body exploration trips. But the best thing you can do for us is leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform and share us with your friends. And we'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
So at the top of the show, you heard a press conference talking about a recently solved case. It was a fairly complicated case. You notice that those people thank a lot of people in there, but they don't thank the FBI. In fact, one of the driving forces of all of that is a genetic consulting firm that specializes in cold cases. It's called UDC. Those guys, this is my guess, I think by the end of the year, they're going to close 2 serial killer cases of serial killers that no one has heard of in Colorado. And I think that I'm going to close a couple of cases for them. I'm going to take the information that Meg has put together, and I'm going to go through unidentified cases out there, and I'm going to help them along on some things that they haven't thought of yet. And I think I'm going to help them close a 3rd serial killer case and 3 to 4 missing persons cases. And that sounds wildly ambitious, and I say but I really mean True Crime XS and like the efforts that people are putting into this behind the scenes. And one of those cases is a case that we covered today. I actually am reaching out to the family of a couple of other cases to talk to them. And I'm still, this is what I'm doing in Colorado. I am still hunting a serial killer that no one has ever heard of. That's literally what we're doing.
Like empires, we rise and then we fall. Can the tides calling through it all? Titans watching, waiting. Once rivals, now we sit patient at the end of the world. Where will we be? Immortality is calling. They'll speak our names forever. Gonna build an empire. Twin pillars, the east and the west, scorch our names in the dirt. They're